Hello friends, this one is a longish video. It's an assembled video based on the following topics. What is the purpose of democracy? Is democracy an objective? Is a democracy an ideal for us? And I've repeatedly said, and I think everyone who has studied political science and its history of mankind understand that democracy is not an objective. It is not a value in itself. It is not something to be aspired for as a goal in society. It is a means to a goal. It's a means to an end. What is the end is the most important. What is the end of all this exercise that we're doing? And the end is freedom. And the end is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To be precise, those are the three wonderful little statements in the American Declaration of Independence. And I think that if we forget that that is the objective, and so our goal is to find out a system by which we can achieve those goals, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, then we will consider democracy as a means. And it has a lot of imperfections. Right through history, people have commented upon its innumerable shortcomings. So democracy per se is not a goal. Now, how do we actually, what we're talking about here is a constitutional republic. What we want is to constrain government. Democracy has the risk that if you believe in democracy, then you believe that anything that a majority of people choose is a good thing because they've chosen that. Well, majorities are very easy to be swayed into demagoguery and crushing life and liberty. We've seen that in many cases where even Hitler used democracy to crush the entire European nations, but also within his own nation, he has effectively crushed the youth and basically made them slaves to his ideology and to his goals. So what we see here is that democracy is majoritism, or whatever you call it, majoritarianism. And we definitely don't want that, right? We don't want, that's actually a value of some sort, and that's a really deadly, dangerous value. So democracy can lead to that particular problem. So we want to control that. We actually need to work backwards from our constitutional republic, in which we have actually controlled the government through the constitution and restricted the role it has to play and defended our freedoms. And once we have done that, then we can look at democracy as a mechanism to get the best, let's say, people to come and join government. And I think that's probably the main point about democracy, that it is a mechanism to find people. Now, if you have direct democracy in a small village, that's quite practical. Everyone can understand that in a small village, the villagers can themselves choose 3, 4, 5, 6 persons to represent them in a particular governing council. There are about 1,000 people in a village, and they can all come together in one assembly. They raise their hands, and that's something that happens in Switzerland, I'm informed, because those are small cantons or whatever they call them. But unfortunately, in a country like India, you can't have direct democracy. You may have direct democracy at the local level, which is possible in some cases, panchayats and so on, but that's a different little issue. We're talking of large-scale representation at the nation, and for that you need indirect democracy. And with indirect democracy, you enter into the issue of the design of democracy. Now let us sort of consider how can you organize indirect democracy. So indirect democracy, the ideal world would be that everything should be unanimous. We should all agree to one candidate in our constituency, and that all people in a parliament, let's say, they all agree to the same thing. That would be a really ideal kind of a situation. And it does occur in a few cases where people all decide that we want to go to war against another nation, or something's happened and really big deal, and everybody has the same view on a particular issue. And that's also part of the job of defending life, liberty, etc. So therefore people as a whole agree to that. Now that's very rare. I would say it's only possible in a very, very few cases where there's complete unanimity. But in general, you're going to have differences of opinion among people. Now, you look at the theory. I'll come to theory. I'll just mention it briefly here. The Arrow's impossibility theorem. Now, Kenneth Arrow discovered that it's basically virtually impossible, and I'm simplifying it, to come to a single view on anything in a large society. And that's pretty much natural given the fact that also we have different backgrounds, different education, different environment, different genes, everything different. And so by the time we end up as adults who are ready to vote, we have formed different views about everything. And so even two people cannot probably agree. Within a household, they may not agree on a single thing. And what about the whole society agreeing on something? So that's really a very big challenge. And that's the whole theory of economics is all about, the assessment of how you actually get public goods and solve the free riding problem and the whole lot of issues around that collective choice kind of a thing. So when people are have to decide about something, we need simple rules to work out when we agree that this is the way everybody will work. So we have to actually have rules. And in general, through history, man has decided on a rule of majoritarianism. That is to say, if a majority of people in a particular situation agree to a certain approach, of course, we're talking about constitutional republics, so all that is defended. The government cannot go and do anything, let's say. So we're talking about majoritarianism in democracy, but subject to all those constraints. But the majoritarianism says that once there is a half of the people have agreed, one more than half, then essentially the whole society has to follow those particular rules or laws or whatever. It's a kind of a ad hoc rule of thumb. It passes the test in most cases. For most relatively medium-sized issues, that's the kind of reasonable thing to do. Now, there are some fundamental other big issues that we cannot really allow a majoritarian rule system. And that's because, let's say we want to change the constitution of the country. That's a really big thing because we are expecting, that defends our existence itself. The whole system is created through the constitution. The whole system is the defense of the regulation of the government, the controls on government, they all are imposed through the constitution. So we then have to have some higher threshold after which we can then decide to change a particular major decision. And that's generally the constitution kind of a thing. And for that, we generally have a 2/3 majority. Now that's all fine. Okay, that's all very good. But then comes to this smaller issue of how do you actually elect people within a constituency? As there can be 10 million people in an average Indian constituency. 2 million people, 2.5 million people in an average Indian constituency. That's a very large number. And for that, what we have to work out is how do we actually aggregate people's preferences? Somebody might want to go in this direction, another in another direction, and another in the third direction, and then two might be close enough, and then another might be quite radically different. How do you possibly aggregate different people's preferences? And this is one of the fundamental things that economics teaches us. You cannot aggregate people's preferences. Just like you cannot have a single common agreed decision among so many people, unanimous decision, it's virtually impossible. You cannot possibly aggregate two separate individuals' preferences. In fact, we ourselves could continuously change our preferences over a lifetime. So we also don't know our own preferences in some cases. At one stage, we might support a particular view. Many young people believe socialism is a great idea. By the time they grow up, they realize actually it's a bad idea. And so they've changed their own mind. But leaving aside that, within a single issue like socialism or freedom, etc., capitalism, there are enormous number of variations. And so when you talk of somebody representing you on a particular, as a single person in a constituency, let's say, you're faced with this enormous problem, theoretical problem of how to aggregate preferences. And fundamentally, you cannot. And because you cannot, it's an impossible task to try to do that. It is very common, for example, in Australia, where they try to do this kind of thing by some kind of aggregation formula. What they're doing is really, they're then forced to do the first preference, the second preference, the third preference, and so on down the line. Everybody has to go to express their preferences in a list, and then they have a mechanism by which they try to aggregate these preferences. But that's a false and a fictitious way of doing things. That is not the way people would actually do or agree to any of these things. So the formula, any other formula apart from whoever gets the largest number of votes is wrong. So we can think of many ways by which we can find representatives, but the only one that really makes sense is anyone who actually gets more support than others. And that person who's got support could be for a range of reasons. They would probably be not perfectly matching, their views don't match perfectly with anybody, but their views match more with a larger number of people. And therefore, that particular person is better representing the view of at least some majority of people, not majority, a significant number of people, than any other person. And then the question is, there are these proportional and other representation systems where they say, okay, let's try to, and they don't use individuals, they use political parties, and I'll come to that separately. That's a real big issue, big problem, because you want a local representative. And therefore, the formula of the first past the post, whoever comes first gets through, was the one that was created and invented in democracy. All major democracies have used first past the post because of its very simple and logical manner of objective manner as well. What it does is, it is not perfect, but one thing is sure, that the person who's a representative, he or she has a strong incentive to bring other people together with him or her. And he cannot survive and get re-elected if he only caters to his own or his or her own constituency. So there's a natural tendency to broaden, and because he or she is a representative, is involved in a larger activity for the whole country or the state, for example, that person automatically his or her view broadens, or should broaden at least. That's the theory. So I think we have seen examples of first past the post in many countries. UK is the greatest and simplest example. That's from where India got its model, but also in countries like USA, Canada, and so on. So there is a large number of countries where the original democracies of the world, many of them, discovered FPTP, first past the post system, and they have flourished as a result of that. There has been no major problems. Now there could be there are other ways and other layers, Westminster democracy, presidential, and so on, and I'll come to that separately. But I wanted to sort of just highlight that there's a mechanism, and the simpler the mechanism and the more consistent it is with the theory, the better the chance that it's going to have some logic to it. Okay, so that's about the general first principles. What about the idea of majority in a parliament? Let's think about it for a minute. Should we actually have a system by which, let's say, somebody who is elected gets plus 1 point, and another one who has lost his seat gets a negative point, and some, can we create another model by which we don't have a model of let's say pure majority, but we've actually allocated points? And somebody had raised this issue, and I would say to that, it's on the basis of the same argument that, number one, you cannot possibly compile people's preferences in any mathematical formula. In no way on earth can you do that. Number one. Number two, any complication to this simple and obvious method will lead to confusion in the minds of people. It will lead to the view that the system is rigged. You don't want to reduce the legitimacy of democracy. The first past of the post system that was picked for India is a very legitimate system. Everybody in the country agrees. Well, not everybody agrees maybe, but what I'm saying is that broadly people agree that this is a legitimate system. It's a legitimate democracy. It's not an illegitimate form of government by which things are surprising. There's a lot of issues about defection of people, etc., and I'll come to that. But really the issue at the moment that I wanted to highlight at this stage is that you should not count you should not aggregate people's preferences. You should not put in formulaic kind of approaches to democracy. Let it be simple, straightforward, and forthright. Everybody understands the simple rules of the game. According to the rules of the game, they would then play. The issue with India, which is what I think is causing a lot of discussion and debate, is the incentives of at the bottom end of the system. That is, how do actually the elections work? How do the people pay for it? How do they actually, should there be a limit of some sort? And those are the issues which are actually causing India a great amount of trouble, because we are getting a large number of corrupt people into the system. It is not, and I repeat, it's not to do with the design of the parliamentary democracy. That's a perfectly fine way of sorting out issues. It's not an issue of majoritarianism in decision making. It's not an issue of majoritarianism in terms of forming government All these are perfectly fine. They work beautifully. They have worked very well in some really advanced countries. You go to the UK, which has been a imperial superpower at one stage. Today is pretty good as well. It's not too bad. These countries, have lived with that system, and they have created great wealth for a vast number of people. So there is nothing fundamentally wrong with that design. So there's a commonly raised issue about whether India should follow the proportional representation system. And the argument is that there are various views that do not get represented in the current system will then have an opportunity to be represented as political parties in the parliament. And today, apparently, what happens is that the bigger parties are expected to be a larger umbrella, so they absorb all these various groups, creating a lack of cohesion within the party, and that leads to a problem for the voter. But if the voter could distinguish and pick the kind of niche that they want, then apparently that would better reflect the voters' preferences. Now that might sound fine in theory, but in practice there are a large number of issues with this kind of a thing. The first thing really is, I'll talk about the really big picture issue first, and then we talk about this, innumerable other issues with the proportional representation system. So the big picture issue is that we want a government to be able to do something. I've seen plenty of governments that are basically stymied by being not able to do anything because of the lack of mandate for a various thing. So whether for the good or for worse, there needs to be a speed of decision making and potential for a government to do something that it believes that it needs to do. And this could be a case of reform in many cases that I'm referring to, and reforms really need a single strong government. The proportional representation system almost invariably has been anti-reform. No matter where it has been implemented, it basically stymies reform. And the reason for that is very obvious, that because of the diversity of views and the political parties that are accommodated within a coalition, because there is virtually no proportional representation model has a single party government. Very rare. It's almost unheard of. And so what you get is these coalitions, and these coalitions are not like a single umbrella where there is a whip and everybody sort of votes together. These are actually different voting organizations. And in that process, what they're doing is that you really cannot get agreement on almost anything. We had the same problem with the Arrow's Impossibility theorem that I spoke about. Well, we have it on a large scale with proportional representation. So PR basically prevents quick action. I have argued that the reforms that India saw in 1991 could not have occurred under proportional representation. Now, even though they were, sort of imposed by the IMF, there is simply no way that those would have been accepted by a coalition PR government. There would have been chaos, like we saw in Greece, for example. It required the strength of, votes and representatives and the party whip, essentially, of Narasimha Rao's Congress to actually get these reforms implemented. And yes, he didn't want them, but he finally did agree, I suppose. It was a voluntary act of his that he wanted it finally to ensure that the country gets some money from IMF and all those kind of conditionalities. But he did it, and he could not have done it. And they were done very quickly, if you remember. So this, I think, is the most fundamental big picture issue, that agility of the government. And then we talk about many other issues. And one of the other issue that comes at a big picture level is the stability. So you expect governments that are formed with the standard Westminster FPTP system to aggregate preferences sufficiently and that they can actually form a stable government for a certain period of time. This may not work in all the cases. We've seen that in India as well, but it does by and large give us a stable government. Now, these are important things for the citizens. The other one that is of great concern is the fragmentation and vulcanization. As I said, people do not agree on anything. You will not agree with what I'm saying, and so on and so forth. Everybody's disagreeing with everybody else. But if you do that on a large scale, in a democracy, in a parliament, you actually cannot get any action done. And what happens is this is the balkanization of ideas, the fragmentation, and virtually everybody's got a little niche here and there, and therefore there's no agreement on anything. I've sort of made this point already about the instability and all the issues around that. One of the things that happens is the welfare-oriented people or the socialist type people, they get a much stronger presence or a much stronger influence using the proportional representation system. Now, we know that in India as well, the socialists have managed to get a huge mandate. But that is because of the history of socialism, which was very strong in the early 20th century. And India simply copied that. India was basically influenced, Nehru and others were influenced by those, existing things that were going on. And a lot of the stuff that happened at that point in time, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and the Fabian socialist idea, the Keynesianism, all were in one direction. They were all leftists. And these leftist ideas came into being into India, but therefore the whole country became socialist. So at that point in time, it wouldn't have mattered whether you had the proportional representation or any other model. But in a normal situation where there are a diversity of views, PR has a strong tendency to actually force the bad ideas into the system, and we see that in Europe in a very big way. So I think I've not been persuaded by the PR model in that sense. And one more thing that is worth mentioning: the idea that for example, this one, the falsification of preferences. So falsification of preferences is when people start doing strategic voting. This is what happens in Australia as well, because of the first preference, second preference, and all these kind of things that happen. There's a lot of strategic voting and strategic preferencing, they call it in Australia, but parties decide whom to give votes to and so on. Now, what you're doing is you're playing with basically people's preferences. So everybody's falsifying things. People are not voting what they want because they want to be somewhere in that sequence. They're playing a game. So you start playing games in the proportional representation model. And I don't think we want to play games in India. Let the people vote whom they want, and we can then pick the best out of that. The most interesting part of the FPTP model is that it is not against small parties like the Liberal Party, Swarnbharat Party, etc. It's not against us. It's not because of the fact that it just requires 35 to 40% of the vote. In many cases today, to win a constituency, you don't need to have a 70% vote. So what we're saying is that FPTP does not preclude small parties from coming in and rising and shining. And I think overall, I've written a little booklet on this issue on my blog. Please do have a look at it. The other one I want to talk about is the presidential versus parliamentary. Very briefly, this has come up with Shashi Tharoor being the strong advocate for presidential model. At one stage, Indira Gandhi was contemplating this model, and some others have periodically raised this issue. And I think there is no justification for changing our model. It is extraordinarily well documented and as proven model. The Westminster model has worked very well. It works extraordinarily well for many reasons. One of the fundamental reasons, the direct responsibility given to the government, because the government is actually both, they form both the voter, the lawmakers essentially. The MPs are the lawmakers, but some of them also become the government. And so there's a direct, expeditious communication between the two, and things don't get stymied. We see a lot of times when the president, the presidential system has the thing gets stymied in some ways at some point in time. But overall, I wouldn't criticize the US model either too much, because there are pros and cons. I would simply say that there are two different sets of democratic design. Neither of them is superior to the other. The parliamentary system, Westminster model that we have is excellent. Let us not talk about changing it. Let's just make this work. And as I've discussed at length in Breaking Free of Narrow, it is the incentives that are destroying it is the bad incentives in the system that are destroying our model, not the actual fact that it's a parliamentary or presidential model. I just want to briefly touch upon the recent issue of defections of MPs and MLAs, and particularly this was Karnataka. We have issued a press release from the Swarn Bharat Party recently. The idea that people are, I think that the two issues that I had sort of distinguished and disentangled in this process. The one is that when you, as a citizen, vote for a particular person, you not only vote for the person as a local representative who's very good, but you may also put some weight to the fact that he or she belongs to a particular political party. So if you are voting on the basis of a person's political party, which I think happens quite a lot, then what we are saying is that the person then joining another party through a lure of XYZ, post or money or whatever, that is a breach of trust. I think that's a really fundamental issue, that you cannot go around changing political party immediately after joining, a parliament, because then you have actually betrayed the voter. Likewise, I think there is the same issue continues where people are busy doing the Ayaram Gayaram issues into the, even in a functioning existing parliament. And people like Narasimha Rao also were responsible for, bribing people and getting them on board and so on. So these are the practicalities of, let's say, democracy, where a lot of money then gets used. So I think the first thing is the a political party candidate must necessarily be deemed to have resigned his or her seat the moment the person changes his or her party. I think that's a fundamental principle by which we should all, think about. Because what we've done is we then prevent people. So if the people want to change a party, and I think there's a provision that if there's a large number, there's a kind of a new party formed or some such thing, that's a different issue. But if there one or two persons want to, come in and change parties, then they need to go back and get re-elected. And in the process of this, I think there needs to be a penalty for them, and some such model has to be devised. Having said that, there is a real problem here also with the whip that our party's manifesto says, the kind of force by which people are, party members are forced to particularly vote for all bills. And I think that's really wrong. We need to give them complete flexibility in almost everything except some critical motions of confidence, no confidence, and some finance bills. Apart from that, I think all MPs, MLAs should be totally free to vote. They can change sides, they can do whatever they want. That is really about good policy making. Whereas the existence or stability of a government is through the whip. So I think these are the kind of broad issues in relation to defection that our party has expressed. Now let's discuss NOTA, that is none of the above. So a lot of people advocate NOTA as a solution to India's problems. Unfortunately, it doesn't even address the remotest part of the problem. So to consider it as a solution is absurd. What it implies is that you are telling, as a citizen, you are telling the Election Commission that, sorry, there is nobody among the candidates who is suitable for my preference, whom I can accept as my representative. Now, I'm afraid that's not how democracy should work. Democracy is about necessarily getting yourself a representative. And if you can't find someone at all in your constituency, then you are obliged to contest elections and show that you are a better candidate than others. And if you get one vote, that's still better than NOTA. You at least have said that you are better than other candidates. That's why you're contesting in the first place. That's a much better signal of your citizenship than NOTA, which is really a signal of your laziness and your anti-democratic approach to life, where you do not want democracy. You are actually a dog in the manger. Neither will you do something yourself, nor will you let others do the representation activity. So I'm afraid NOTA is a really bad idea. And the worst case that can happen is, or the best case for NOTA rather, is that when a majority of people in a constituency vote for NOTA, or that becomes, let's say, not a majority, the largest single so-called candidate, then the Election Commission has to hold the election once again. But sorry, if nothing has changed, and if you are not willing to come forward and contest, you still have the same old bad candidates. What are you going to do? It's an infinite sequence of stupidity. It's a lack of citizenship, it's laziness, it is also stupidity. It's a waste of taxpayers' money. It's basically saying that you are shirking your responsibility. So, and finally, I think, I just want to close very briefly. I won't go into detail. I've already kind of, discussed it in many places. Is the issue of incentives for politicians to be right. State funding of elections using first past the per vote basis reimbursement. That means if whoever gets valid votes, they get a certain amount, say 50 rupees or some such thing based on the vote for per valid vote, and so that gives them honest people an incentive to enter the system. And I've discussed this recently in relation to comments from Raj that he had concerns, and I've actually explored this, so I won't go into details there. But also it needs to be supplemented with a security deposit being lifted, because otherwise you get too many candidates. But only serious candidates should be allowed to enter, so that you actually have this. You got to be serious that you are really a good candidate and you want to do something good for the constituency. Then you have to put the money into the system, and then you can contest. That's not a problem. And finally, there must be some decent salaries for MPs, MLAs, but no pensions and so on, and no other perks. So by decent salary, what would do is people who are professionals and others, and I'm not saying professionals are particularly good at policy making, but people who are, say, good at policy making, but currently have no capacity to fund their election, they will start entering the system. And their entry, if you get a Lee Kuan Yew, for example, a great lawyer in India, you get a kind of person like him, you've hit jackpot. But today you're driving away all such people outside India. So I think our point should be to get as many of the top-notch talented people into the positions of government, because government actually plays a more significant role in the progress of society than even science. Science cannot prosper without a good government. So you need a good constitution and a good government in order to create industry, wealth, and general prosperity. Okay, that's all for today.